All right, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you as always for taking the time to be with us today. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And today we're delighted to hear from Alexander Mattelaer, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Royal Institute for International Relations, for his talk titled NATO's Nuclear Comeback. And if you have been following CGSR discussions over the last several weeks, the last several months, the last several years, you will know we've had a lot of speakers and a lot of papers and a lot of discussion on this topic of what steps NATO has taken and what steps NATO should take, given its own assessments regarding the changes in the European security environment since Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and its most recent invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So we're very fortunate to have such a great speaker with us today to talk about how Putin's nuclear rhetoric, Russia's military activities have really brought nuclear deterrence back to the center of the European security debate and prompted the alliance to reinvigorate its nuclear policy and posture. And so he's going to talk, I think, a little bit about sort of looking back and what they've done in very recent summits. And then he's going to take us forward and say, you know, what is going to happen at the summits that are going to take place this year, summits that are going to take next year. And sort of what more can NATO do in addition to sort of the modernization environment underway. And this is all important for the National Laboratory because there is such a debate right now in the national security space in the United States about regional deterrence capabilities and what's more is needed. And this was highlighted in the Strategic Posture Commission report of if, you know, the capabilities we have today are not sort of fit for the security environment in both the Asia region and in Europe, then what more can be done? What more should be done? So let me say a little bit more about the speaker. He is a senior research fellow at Egmont, which is the Royal Institute for International Relations, and he's associate professor at the VUB Brussels School of Governance. He's also affiliated with the Belgian Royal Higher Institute for Defense as chairman of the scientific committee. As a Fulbright Schumann Fellow, he completed research days at Harvard University and the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He has a wide variety of research interests, including the politics of European integration, NATO and transatlantic relations, deterrence, defense, and military strategy, and the perpetual redefinition of international relations and statecraft. He also has a broad teaching portfolio, including classes on the European Union, international security, strategic studies, and modern diplomacy. The ground rules for this talk, as always, the speaker is going to deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we're going to open the floor up for the audience to be engaged in the discussion. At any point in time, as Alex is talking, please feel free to raise your hand electronically. Please feel free to get your questions into the chat functions, and that way it's easy for me as the moderator to get the discussion rolling as soon as he finishes. And that way I can also get as many of your questions and comments and ideas into the discussion as possible. And I see that Katie has the slides up on the screen. So with that, Alex, thank you for taking the time to physically be with us on site. I'm delighted to hear the talk, and over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Mike. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear also online. Please give a shout if that is not the case. It's a great pleasure to join you here at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. First time for me visiting, but really delighted about the possibility of swinging by today and give you a Belgian/European perspective on the ongoing conversation on NATO's nuclear deterrence adaptation. Now, as you have heard already, I'm affiliated with Egmont, which is our foreign policy affiliated think tank. Belgium got into the nuclear business as a NATO ally from the late 1950s onwards. And this is something that institutionally we have always tried to keep a close track of within the constraints, the human resources constraints in particular of what we have, which really means, and I also say this by way of introduction, the nuclear community back home is like really a handful of people. You have a few people in the think tank context, you have a handful of people in government, you then have another small bunch of people in the Air Force, but it is a very, very small and tightly knit community in which my role as a think tanker covering this topic is try to sort of take the bird's eye perspective out of all of this. Probably I will have way less knowledge about specific discussions than many of you here in the audience, but that is also the beauty of coming from a smaller country, that you're sort of forced to take a big picture approach to things. And my overall observation is that NATO really stands at a juncture, because as a result of the escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine, and in particular the fact that that aggression has been systematically accompanied by nuclear threats, nuclear deterrence has really, since 2022, all of a sudden made this very, very big comeback to European security debates, and that is what I want to talk about in this lecture. Next slide, please. So, as those of you who are familiar with NATO's history, you will undoubtedly know during the Cold War decades, NATO consistently had this pretty maximalist, very robust nuclear deterrence posture that really gradually atrophied following the conclusion of the Cold War. It gradually morphed into what we might call a very minimalist nuclear posture, especially the nuclear sharing component of the posture. That is to say, the NATO bit that complements US deterrence posture, and that now has all of a sudden dived into a debate over, well, is this minimalist posture actually up to standards in the light of the radically different nuclear threat environment that has come into being as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. The key outcomes of the previous NATO summit meeting in the summer of 2023 pertain to the updating of planning to increase the flexibility and adaptability of NATO's nuclear forces. Second, the alliance reaffirmed its commitment to ensure the broadest possible participation in the nuclear burden sharing. And thirdly, it also recommitted to pursue greater integration and coherence across domains, so bringing the nuclear deterrence and the conventional deterrence and defense planning part of the equation closer together. And that is really what I want to talk about in this presentation from an outsider's point of view on an unclassified basis, try and make sense of these different debates taking place within NATO's nuclear planning group on deterrence adaptation. For those of you who are interested in more about the backward-looking, the historical part of the argument, there's a new Routledge Handbook of NATO coming out in 2 months' time, for which I authored the nuclear chapter. So if you want to learn more about NATO's posture during the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period, that is detailed in much greater detail in that text that is set to appear just before the summer. But before turning to these 3 big ongoing conversations, if you will, updating planning, broadening participation, and increasing coherence, let's also pay some attention to what is actually the evolution of the threat, because NATO's deterrence, of course, is not something that stands in isolation from what is going on the Russian side. Next slide, please. So I won't read all of this text out loud. It are 3 longer quotes that I've drawn from 3 of the big Russian leadership speeches delivered in the course of 2022. First, the speech Vladimir Putin delivered when the invasion was launched. He is essentially stating that Russia disposes of a certain advantage in terms of its nuclear arsenal. The second quote is from September 2022, so a few months later. The Russian leadership wants NATO, wants Western leaders and policy planners to have no doubt about Russian resolve to make use of that advantage that was already highlighted. And then last but not least, from the annexation address at the end of September 2022, this quote signals that Russia takes a very expansive view of the Russian territory. Yeah? So the provinces of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. Vladimir Putin refers to that as we will defend our land with all the forces and resources we have. This is not a bluff, etc., etc. So you're familiar with that discourse. But if you take everything together, it amounts to what is now often referred to as aggressive sanctuarization, taking the Russian nuclear umbrella as a shield under which conventional aggression can be pursued by first intimidating the leadership in Kiev and in Western capitals and increasing the risks of seeking to push back. Now, of course, you know that zooming out, that has not yielded great results because Ukrainian armed forces have consistently kept on fighting back, even if Western assistance, with the benefit of hindsight, was a bit slow in terms of being built up. Overall, the Russian nuclear intimidation did not yield the ideal effect of everyone just getting totally spooked by those threats and therefore not coming to the assistance of Ukraine. So Western assistance has been flowing. You can, of course, say, yeah, that the slow arrival of Western assistance, is that attributable to Russian nuclear intimidation or not? That's a bit in the eye of the beholder. In any case, NATO capitals have been adamant that they should not allow themselves to be intimidated by this rhetoric alone, because obviously by accepting those threats as real and fueling constraints, it would open the door to aggressive sanctuarization to be pursued elsewhere and continuously. Bottom line, the question is, where does this then end if such threats would yield Russia any positive advantage? But I highlight in the first quote that element of that material advantage of which Russia thinks of itself that it holds. And that brings us more to a discussion of the Russian non-strategic arsenal. Next slide, please. The fact is that the Russian Federation today has at its disposal a broad array of non-strategic nuclear weapon options. The unclassified literature suggests that Russia has close to 2,000 non-strategic warheads fielded, combining all sorts of systems, naval systems, dual-capable aircraft, all kinds of missile systems. And probably altogether, these add up to a well-thought-through approach, allowing the Russian Federation to compensate for conventional inferiority vis-à-vis NATO on the battlefield via an approach building on controlled escalation. And I think this audience will be already well aware of that. I list a couple of examples of weapon systems here on the slide. The bottom line from a NATO defense planning point of view is the Russian Federation is in a position to hold at risk all sorts of major targets all across the area of responsibility of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Next slide, please. The good news is that from the NATO's point of view, there is a response to all of that, because building on that entire legacy of NATO's experience throughout the Cold War, the fact that there are Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons out there, this is not new. This has been the case for many, many, many decades. But essentially, those Russian threats have reminded the alliance of why NATO has held on to its own nuclear deterrence posture for all those decades, because Russian threats and Vladimir Putin's very specific messaging has essentially highlighted that NATO's own nuclear deterrence, in particular the theater level component to that, is essential to put a lid on Russian escalation dominance. In the NATO jargon, the fundamental purpose of NATO's nuclear deterrence is to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. It's specifically the preventing coercion that has been highlighted in practice over the past 2 years very, very prominently. And of course, that own NATO deterrence posture relies on capabilities provided by the US, United Kingdom, as well as France, as 3 strategic arsenals, and the US provided non-strategic weapons that are part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. What is, of course, also important is the resolve to treat alliance security as indivisible and to signal a willingness to impose unacceptable cost. That communication has really been highlighted quite prominently already a few years ago from the Warsaw Summit in 2016 onwards. And there is also the communication aspect of NATO's deterrence that has evolved quite a lot in recent years as well. As I already said in the introduction, at the Vilnius Summit last summer, we saw 3 big announcements when it came to NATO nuclear adaptation: the task to update the planning, the reaffirmation of the imperative to ensure the broadest possible participation in nuclear burden sharing, and then thirdly, the need to ensure a greater integration and coherence across domains, and I'm sort of summarizing here, so as to be ready and able to deter aggression and manage escalation risks in a crisis that has a nuclear dimension. So every time NATO publishes another summit communique, it's a good exercise to really pay attention to what is the new language, in what way has existing language slightly evolved over time, because in the unclassified domain, that are really the main ways of getting the official cues as to what is going on. So I'll now talk a bit more in detail about these 3 conversations. Next slide, please. So to start with the part on updating nuclear planning. So as a reminder, until quite recently, we were in a position where NATO had this very minimalist posture, because already in the early 1990s, the alliance discontinued nuclear targeting, discontinued maintaining peacetime nuclear plans. NATO, once upon a time, had a very diversified theater-level nuclear arsenal at its disposal. 6,000 to 7,000 warheads deployed in different allies on all sorts of different delivery systems. Belgium, once upon a time, had no less than 5 different delivery systems by means of which Belgium armed forces would have been able to employ the use of US-provided nuclear weapons, of course, with the consent of the United States, because the NATO weapons are all held in strict custody of US armed forces until a very late moment in time. But that sub-strategic NATO arsenal, it effectively shrunk to just small numbers of dual-capable aircraft provided by a very small number of allies, with a very small number of US weapons stored on the territory of, again, a handful of allies in Europe. And that posture, it really starts changing from the Warsaw Summit onwards in 2016, because there were already more veiled nuclear threats accompanying the initial Russian aggression against Ukraine that started in 2014. But overall, NATO took a very restrained approach to reacting against the initial aggression. So there was a bit of declaratory change from 2016 onwards. Actually, the conventional deterrence adaptation really already started in 2014 onwards, and both the conventional adaptation as well as the nuclear adaptation, they started very slowly, nearly grudgingly, you would say, because at that point in time, the NATO consensus on the need for adaptation was relatively shaky. You had some allies being on the demand side for strong adaptation, other allies being more skeptical over the need, whether a lot of adaptation was really necessary, perhaps that degree of tension with Russia would go away just as easily as it has come about. So overall, the nuclear adaptation, it started the latest compared to all the rest, and also arguably it has been the most it has been pursued in the most grudging way possible. It originally got underway, the adaptation that we've so far really seen was adaptation pertaining to the modernization of the DCA delivery systems and the upgrade of the weapons to the B61-12, but that was really already all underway for a longer time and not really tied to this dramatic deterioration of the security environment that we have seen. Now, all the adaptation that was already underway when the new strategic concept was codified in 2022, that really provided what was already accepted, the NATO acquis, if you will. And from the Vilnius summit onwards, we get really new stuff entering into the NATO communiques. So if we see this single line about updating planning, well, that was something that has not been part of any NATO official statement for many years, that is to say decades, because what has now happened is, well, the North Atlantic Council has effectively tasked the nuclear ops people in shape to rewrite nuclear plans, come up with a new nuclear concept of operations, and importantly, to also redevelop a targeting set for that exercise. They can draw on both whatever is in the NATO institutional inventory with the nuclear sharing platforms, but conceivably also think of potential targets that can be put forward to the US and the UK for other systems. It also brings up questions over whether that minimal posture at the theater level, in which NATO for theater level deterrence depends exclusively on dual capable aircraft, whether that is sufficient. Now, of course, NATO planners will have to work within the constraints of what is the set of decisions that has been announced in the US NPR, etc. So presumably in the short term, what is really up for debate is the number of dual capable aircraft that will be earmarked for the nuclear mission compared to other missions. But the bigger question that is lurking in the background is the combination of F-35s armed with B-61-12s, is that sufficient as an instrument for fulfilling the purpose of NATO's nuclear deterrence objectives vis-à-vis this much larger, much more diversified nuclear arsenal that we see on the Russian side. And I think if you sort of zoom out without being in the loop on the detailed discussions, if you now task military planners to redo all the planning in the light of the new security environment, I think it is quite logical to expect that they will come up with something that looks very different from the status quo of the past that came into being really sort of as one remaining legacy item of the Cold War posture that got gradually taken apart over multiple decades. In essence, the combination of gravity bombs and dual capable aircraft, it was kept in place as a sort of break glass insurance in case NATO's nuclear deterrence posture would ever need to be resurrected. And in effect, we have now hit that point at which at that point in time 31 allies, now 32 allies, have come to the conclusion that yes, NATO's nuclear deterrence posture is actually essential because it underpins all the rest in the conventional domain. I'll talk about that more in a second. And therefore, it also needs to be up for meeting the threat environment that it faces today, which probably means something significantly larger, significantly more robust, survivable, and diversified than what currently exists. This is just a guess, but I think given the long-term evolution, it's probably a guess that that is not coming as a big surprise to any of you. Next slide, please. The second and much more political discussion concerns the notion of broadening participation in NATO's nuclear deterrence. Now, what we know from the sort of the press releases of NATO's annual nuclear exercise, the code name of which has been declassified some time ago, exercise Steadfast Noon. We see from the press releases the number of allies taking part and providing conventional support to nuclear operations. The acronym is CISNO these days. Used to be SNOWCAT. That number is growing, so Steadfast Noon in its most recent iteration involved like sort of 60-something aircraft and 13-something allies participating. But the fact is that the nuclear leg of Steadfast Noon and actually the delivery of nuclear weapons is today still limited to what has become a very small community of allies fielding operational dual-capable aircraft, 4 European ones and the United States. That is really the result of, well, back in the old days, a number of allies discontinuing that mission. And then during the 1990s, in a different time frame, US Secretary of State Warren Christopher famously codified the 3 nuclear no's that eventually found their way into the NATO-Russia Founding Act that stated that NATO had no reason, no intention, etc., to deploy nuclear weapons elsewhere to the newer allies. Now, of course, to what extent the constraints of the NATO-Russia Founding Act still apply are hotly debated at NATO headquarters. Poland has quite openly advocated for its ambition to join the community of allies fully involved in the nuclear mission. There may be others. There have been some indications in all kinds of, well, not official statements, but indications that several allies may be interested in joining the community of dual-capable aircraft flying allies. Potentially, it could also involve other delivery systems, of course, but then we're going back to the previous debate. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there is no consensus on that discussion, at least at this point in time. But we do see a certain clear articulation of reasons that are being provided in support of specific proposals to broaden participation, or reasons provided for being more hesitant about that. And I think the strategically most salient arguments are the following. If you think back about the ongoing work on updating planning, and if that is going to lead to the identification of a clear need for a more robust posture, if you have more allies participating, you can distribute that responsibility over more shoulders and get a much larger number of allies implicated in that mission, really, as was the case in a more distant past, because when nuclear sharing came into being, it were actually some allies that decided for themselves to stay out of that for specific reasons. But those were the exceptions. Now it is the other way around. Secondly, precisely because any decision to broaden participation would really sort of put all the constraints codified in the NATO-Russia Founding Acts really to sleep. It would also signal to the Russian Federation very clearly that NATO's resolve would be increasing, and in particular, if you go back to the deterrence basics, that resolve component and the need to signal clear resolve is essential to deterrence, and arguably there is, of course, a resolved problem that is emanating from the fact that the current allies flying the nuclear sharing mission being limited to old Western European allies, that raises questions about how strong NATO's resolve to deter aggression against frontline states really is. And that, otherwise put, also brings us to a third argument, which is really also a very old argument, because I think it was Sacker, Loris Norstad in the 1960s who came up with that argument the first, that there cannot be any perception of first class versus second class ally status in the alliance. Either the nuclear umbrella protects everyone, and NATO's security is indeed indivisible, or not. But there is no sort of in-between, more graduated understanding of nuclear deterrence possible. So I think if you take those three arguments together, the case for broadening participation has become quite strong. In particular, because the most obvious counter argument hanging on to the three nuclear no's in the NATO Russia Founding Act, given how the relationship with Russia has evolved, given how Russia has started instrumentalizing nuclear threats for aggressive purposes, that argument, which perhaps in 2016 was still a strong argument, has lost much of its potency. There is, however, one other element that should lead us to realize that broadening participation is really no panacea to solve all the problems. In NATO's nuclear deterrence decision-making, in the nuclear planning group, decisions are still taken by consensus. So any decision to do things will not be contingent on which allies are involved in the execution of the nuclear mission, and which allies are delivering just conventional support to nuclear operations. I'm actually pretty convinced if there is a nuclear planning group decision to do things, and SACEUR receives the instruction to do this or that, SACEUR will find ways of executing executing the mission that he will be given, and who does what exactly, flying the nuclear mission or flying conventional support, it may have an impact on ally perceptions, on reassurance, etc. But the big challenge for future adaptation, for doing whatever may need to be done in the future, the big challenge still relates to nurturing a strong nuclear planning group consensus, irrespective of who does what. So we should guard ourselves against expecting all problems to be solved if we get to a decision to broaden participation in the nuclear mission, because most of the problems will still stay, I think, exactly the same problems, even if you have a few more countries flying DCA, or even if you were to reintroduce a second or a third delivery system in a nuclear sharing context. Now, one element that is, I think, also more on an operational level worthy of paying some attention to is that of the basing network. for the dual-capable aircraft. Of course, if you have more allies participating in the nuclear mission, you can start upgrading more bases to being able to support and sustain nuclear operations. Conceivably, this could also be expanded to more delivery systems. So on an operational level, actually broadening participation, if we get to a positive decision and a positive consensus in the nuclear planning group, it actually does provide all sorts of new ways for the nuclear operations planners to get creative, and in particular to also reduce the vulnerability of the posture as it exists today, and to complicate adversary targeting, which is also probably important given where we are today. All right, next slide, please. Let's turn, last but not least, to the integrating nuclear deterrence into conventional defense planning conversation. Now, I've explained earlier that NATO's nuclear adaptation has been lagging behind in time NATO's conventional deterrence and defense adaptation, which has now advanced very significantly from 2014 to 2024. We now have new regional plans in place, etc. So the conventional part of the story has really made, I mean, there are still issues pertaining to the resourcing of the plans, of course, and which requires growing the forces of individual allies, etc. But conceptually speaking, the conventional part of the story has made great headway. But it has made great headway by assuming that all the conventional stuff happens in isolation from the nuclear bits, and really the conventional planning effort now needs to be reminded that, well, all conventional operation plans are fundamentally premised on the assumption that nuclear deterrence holds. So the overall, for NATO in total, the success of nuclear deterrence must remain the priority one mission, and in particular the conventional plans that have already been approved last year in Vilnius. It's really also a sort of an ongoing planning endeavor, but the planners need to recognize the critical vulnerability that those plans have to the threat of nuclear escalation that Vladimir Putin keeps reminding all of us of. And that pertains to all the major ports that are critical points of debarkation, the major air bases, command and control hubs, all the machinery needed for maintaining NATO's logistics, even troop concentrations, etc., etc. Now, given that NATO's nuclear posture at present is quite thin, it also bears reminding that NATO's conventional defense and its nuclear deterrence rely to a very substantial degree on the same capabilities. And within the conventional community, everyone needs to bear in mind that in a crisis, the nuclear requirements will in fact take precedence. And that also then means, and that's the third argument why this integration is so important, the conventional concepts of operations and the nuclear courses of action need to be considered simultaneously in planning and exercising. And I think that's also what the great work here pursued at the Center for Global Security Research is contributing to, because that is really the sort of cutting edge part of the deterrence conversation, to get the wargaming endeavor out of the institutional stovepipes again. actually, again, NATO's own history reminds us that this all used to take place back in the Cold War. There was the Wintex series during the 1980s when scenarios were considered in which conventional defense and nuclear deterrence and nuclear deterrence potentially failing were all thought through in great detail, which is something that the alliance has not been doing for now really multiple decades, but out of prudence, it must now return to, not to be caught with its proverbial pants down. Next slide, please. If you take those arguments and go a bit more into the detail of things, in particular, the squeeze on certain capability sets, you have the US Air Force bombers and you have the dual capable aircraft fielded by allies concerned. You have the much larger group of conventional fighter aircraft. You have all the tanker aircraft. You have the, at present, very limited numbers of ground and sea-based air defenses. And you have the small numbers of long-range standoff munition stocks. Well, it are all things, it's all kit that is super essential for the conventional deterrence and defense posture, but it is also at the core of NATO's nuclear deterrence posture. So I think the planning takeaway is that all those capabilities need to be dimensioned for these multiple mission sets in parallel, and actually for deterrence communication purposes, these actually may also require visible differentiation for deterrence signaling purposes. In the past, the assumption in sort of a shrinking posture overall was that things can be double-hatted and it's cheaper that way, it's more efficient that way. But the problem is, of course, if you have an ongoing conventional campaign and you need to do nuclear deterrence in parallel, you cannot have that double-hatting, and it requires a much larger capability set. Given where we are in the relationship with Russia, I think it is also prudent to assume that nuclear signaling will feature very prominently in any Article 5 scenario, which then really means that as NATO goes about deliberating its response and executing any response, lots of capability may be at least temporarily unavailable for executing conventional missions. How the conventional defense part and the nuclear deterrence part unfolds, that really must be thought through in advance so that these things can operate in sync. And in fact, these need to constitute different components of a single theory of victory. Yeah, I guess everyone here in this room is already well aware of those. But let me assure you, in the NATO community in Europe, that is not something that many people are well aware of, because the nuclear community had become so cloistered up, locked up in its own little room somewhere in the basement. And it is something that the much wider NATO community is fundamentally, up until very recently, quite unaware of. But so in that sense, getting back to that single theory of victory with nuclear and conventional instruments working hand in hand is so important. There is then, last but not least, also an important resilience and survivability discussion unfolding, which is also a much broader effort underway. But as far as the nuclear deterrence elements thereof are concerned, the need to sort of disperse assets, the need to grow the number of air defense systems, to harden the infrastructure, also taking electromagnetic pulse effects into account, growing the suite of CBRN capabilities, having more redundancy in the system overall. There are all things that people have now woken up about, that it's actually important. And if you take all of that together, given that it did not take place for a good 25 to 30 years, if you add all of that up, you realize that we have really hit this major juncture in which this overall comeback is taking place. Minimizing vulnerability, maximizing continuity of operations within the NATO expert community, that's now well recognized. Now, of course, getting that well understood by the political leadership in all allies, that's another matter, and that is also why strategic communication to domestic audiences is so important. All right, let me wrap up here. Next slide, please. So, bottom line, my key points were, well, NATO's vulnerability to Russian nuclear coercion is real. It's not that there are no answers possible. They are clearly there, but work is needed. Second, that means that there is a major nuclear deterrence adaptation discussion that has got underway. Much of the outcomes will still situate themselves presumably in the future, because we can already see that what's going on is now radically different from anything that has been going on in the post-Cold War period, but much of the outcomes still need to happen. Now, to the extent that I'm feeling confident to speculate about the future, bearing in mind that social scientists have an awful track record in getting the future correct, I want to stay very prudent. But I nonetheless think that given the kind of conversations that are now underway, I would assume that we may see some relatively significant posture changes as a likely outcome of everything that is underway. And I think for everyone working here in Lawrence Livermore is concerned, I think that then may entail a requirement for both additional weapons and additional delivery systems is something at least within the realm of what people can imagine. I'll leave it at that and very much look forward to any questions and comments that you may have, and feel free to be as critical as you'd like. Thanks.